Okay, good stuff. Good to celebrate with you what God is doing here. That is tremendous. I'm glad you have events like this. We have our district event in the fall, and I remember from my years here in the past, the February event here in Central California, and it's just good to be here. Looking forward to more of this stuff. Okay, let's get into our third session. Now let me tell you a little bit of kind of where I'm at with this. I've been actually reworking some of these slides. In fact, I had to get this uploaded at the last minute here as I'm interacting with you and hearing you and so forth, both because of what you're saying and some of the stuff that I'm hearing God saying. I've made a few tweaks, because here's one of my concerns as I go into this third session here. And those of you that were here last night heard this, and for those of you that were not here last night, you need to hear this for sure. And that is that, because in this session, I'm going to propose to you something. I'm going to give you actually a proposal as to how you can implement this. But that is always dangerous, because the danger is you're going to look at this and go, yeah, here he comes. He wants us to change everything and throw out what we've done and do something different. And in some ways, I'm challenging you. And if God leads you, if God's prompting you to say, yeah, we should look at this and maybe implement this, then you need to do that. But I'm not here to be the one to say that you must do this or you have to do this, or I'm going to try to sell you on this, because this isn't about selling programs or trying to convince you that this is the perfect system. Once you adopt this, that it's all going to be roses and Lucky Charms and all that kind of stuff. There you go. We bring some cereal into it. It's not like that. I mean, whatever you're going to do, and I really believe this as well, that we're going to have to struggle through this in the next number of years as we really try to find new normal, not only within the church, but within our society. We live in a society that's broken. And we have people that are broken that are coming to us, and here we are trying to do God's work in the midst of a lot of brokenness, and some of that brokenness ends up affecting us, and we do end up with the dark days and the dark moments and the times when in the church we feel like we're like the children of Israel wandering around the wilderness, and we want to go back to Egypt. And it's not easy. So these are challenges, these are difficult. I would not want you to do any of this stuff if God is not leading you to do that. But I do challenge you to at least hear what God might be saying to you. Because maybe God is out of this going to prompt you to say, we need to at least look at some of this or all of this or whatever. Because remember, one of the things I told you last night as well is that when we leave here today and in the afternoon session, excuse me, I'm going to make sure that everyone leaves here, whether you're a church of 10 or of 1,000, that, oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'll probably do that. That whether you're a church of 10 or 1,000, I'm going to have some practical stuff that you can take home with you. Okay, so you're going to, even if you don't adopt everything I tell you today, you will have some things that will be helpful. Even hopefully the discussion on spaces will be something that will be meaningful for you to take home. So I tell you all that because I really want you to hear my heart on this. I don't, as we go into this next session, don't get lost in the detail and feel that we're trying to sell you something. Okay, I want to talk a little bit, because we've been talking about church decentralization. What does decentralized ministry in the post-pandemic church look like? So let's do a little history of decentralization. Because I think you need to understand that this is not a new thing. And throughout history, we can go back actually in the Middle Ages, and I'm not going to go back that far. But let's go back to the 18th century. And probably one of the first attempts to look at decentralizing the church was John Wesley, who is in some ways a spiritual grandfather for the Church of God movement. We come out of the Wesleyan Arminian, have a lot of background there. And John Wesley, back in the 18th century, he was part of the Church of England, and also did ministry here in America at points as well. He was wanting to, or he recognized that the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was missing a number of significant factors in its church life. And so John Wesley, he was a very, and I obviously didn't know him, but just when you read his writings and you see these things that he developed, he was a very methodical, that's what I call it, Methodism, methodical thinker, systematic, strategic, and he had all these great ideas as to how the church could be strengthened. In fact, his goal originally wasn't to start a new denomination, it was to reform and to invigorate the Anglican Church. But in the end, they didn't see eye to eye, and he ended up, Methodism evolved out of that. But John Wesley in the 18th century is part of an antidote in many ways to this high church worship that in itself was nothing wrong with it, but it left wanting a lot. And so he created a number of different groups, which for the church, and certainly within the Protestant world, was really unique. And he created societies, classes, bands, select societies, and penitent bands. How do you like to list a list like that in your church bulletin on Sunday? Here's the different programs that we offer. But he had all these different purposes, different ways that they met, different ways that they were composed. And if you ever do a historical study on that, it is really fascinating. Appropriate for its time, but things that we can learn maybe perhaps from that. It was transformative, but even Methodists today don't practice it because it was way too detailed and too involved. And if you read through again, how it was developed and the structures that were put in place, it was fascinating, but they couldn't scale it. Remember the quote I gave you last night about the fact that we got to scale relationships, not programs and institutions? Well, I think John Wesley, even though he recognized the importance of relationships, he built a structure that really required a lot of scaling. And to do that, he built in a lot of control, and there was just too much control there. And without somebody like him controlling it, the whole thing after his death and subsequent leaders just was not able to take hold. But I tell you that because I think you need to kind of get a picture as to how some of these things have evolved. And then in the 19th century, I even bring to your attention the Church of God, because we're, not that maybe people outside the Church of God recognize this all the time, although we did have significant influence, perhaps in ways that many do not fully appreciate and recognize. But the Church of God, in many ways, was a decentralizing movement. We started out as well. We weren't going to start a new denomination. We were a movement, and there was a lot of fluidity that was there. But you know what's really fascinating? The Church of God began as this loose band of passionate believers who wanted to make a difference. And they functioned like a family. Family was a big thing. There was a lot of this brother and sister, Brother Guzman or whatever. There was this they really saw the importance of family. And in many ways, they functioned in social space. That's where they did do public, eventually as they evolved, the public space became more and more significant, but they lived within social space tremendously. One of the best examples of it, and some of you are aware of this, some of you are not, the missionary home movement of the Church of God, back in the early 1900s, was extremely innovative for its time. It was a great idea that unfortunately did not persist for some of the same reasons Methodism didn't. And John Wesley's ideas is that the infrastructure that it required was too heavy and they couldn't sustain it. It cost a lot of money, and It was unworkable. But the idea was fascinating, where they would go into major cities and they would create these missionary homes where people lived together to do God's mission in that community. And it'll be, when I talk about missional communities in a few minutes, maybe that will ring a bell. So some of this stuff is not new. There's been attempts for hundreds of years to try to incorporate some of these decentralizing impulses within the church. And these would be some examples of that. And then in the 20th century, we go to the small group movement. I think all of you are familiar with this to some extent. Whether you know the history of it or not is irrelevant, but you've been affected by it. Because in the 20th century, as churches got larger, it was more and more recognized that, man, we've got to do things to get our people connected with each other. We need to do Bible study. We need to be doing discipleship. We need to be doing training. And especially as churches got super large, just the fact of getting people connected with each other in relationships. So small groups, there's different histories as to when they started. They really took hold after World War II. And there's especially then once you get to the 60s and 70s. In fact, there was even some Church of God connections in there if you want to dig deep in terms of when the small group movement really began to emerge and burgeon. But there was just a recognition we have to get people into small groups. And some of you have done things like serendipity. Some of you remember the serendipity Bible studies that were really big at one point. There were, and now of course it's become a big industry, the small group movement. There's tons of curriculum and resources available and all sorts of things. Churches are trying different things to do to get people into small groups, especially as the churches get larger, and they recognize that the public space is inadequate, so we have to find personal spaces for people to connect them. Now, I'm a big believer in small groups, and I don't want you to hear me say we shouldn't have small groups. We need them, because that's part of the personal space aspect. We can do things in small groups we can't do elsewhere. So keep doing small groups. Don't ever stop doing small groups. But the problem is that we become overly dependent on small groups. We put expectations on small groups that are not realistic. I am a big advocate of small groups. I told you last night I was at church planter. We were using at that point what was called the meta-church model, which was kind of a hyper cell group model that has had tremendous influence on the small group movement. And so I really believe in it. But what we discovered is, in theory, the small group movement looks really good. In practice, it falls short on a couple of things. And one is, small groups are generally ineffective at outreach in terms of incorporating new people. As I talked about earlier, because of the tight bonds that are created, it's hard for new people to come into small groups. And then secondly, ministry mobilization. The theory is we can get some of these groups out there doing ministry, and yeah, occasionally they can, but it becomes very programmatic, and it's really hard to get small groups to become outward focused. And a lot of it is because of their size. There's social dynamics there that really play into it. So these are some attempts. None of them are bad. They've all had influence and meant much of it good. But that's kind of where we're at, and that's how we've kind of limited our thinking to this point of decentralization. So I want to show you an image. This is a diagram here that kind of describes what the centralized church looks like today. So this is what I would say most congregations today in North America in particular, this is how we're structured. And that is essentially that I picked the color red kind of to demonstrate where the focus is. The red hot center, if you want to call it, has been on worship. And then we supplement that by dividing people out into small groups. So we're saying, let's Our Sunday morning is our experience. That's what counts. That's what matters. We're going to put all of our energy into that. And if you're a pastor, you've been trained this way and you've been conditioned this way, and you probably spend most of your time preparing for the Sunday morning experience, because that is the experience that matters in our world. Now, again, nothing wrong with Sunday morning, nothing wrong with worship, all good stuff. But that becomes how we're designed. And then we try to build out small groups, recognizing we have to, especially as the church gets larger, that we have to find ways to meet those other needs. That is, I think we're familiar with that. There are challenges with it, with this particular approach to doing things. And so let's just take a look here. And what I would say are three limitations that the centralized church has in our world. And I think one of them is growth limits. It is hard when we have this model, we can hit growth ceilings really quickly. Now, some churches are able to break through those, but there are difficulties, and it really feeds to the second point, which is there's a limited span of care that can happen in a centralized church, mainly because a lot of it falls onto the responsibility of care falls onto the pastor. And as the church gets larger, in fact, one of the main reasons that, apart from some of the social dynamics I talked about earlier, one of the main reasons churches stop growing and rarely get past 75 to 100 is because of the capacity for the pastor to care for that number of people. If there's a pastoral dependency on pastoral care and pastoral services. And so what ends up happening is, so what do we do when we hit those points? Well, we hire staff. So we feel like we have to get more staff to spread the load. And when I say care covers a lot of things. I mean, certainly involves things like hospital visitations and stuff, but it's more than that. It's that personal touch, that your connection to the church is through a real live human being, and the pastor is that face to the church that everybody is depending on and relies upon, and the pastor is involved in so many different aspects of the church's life. But the span of care diminishes as the church grows. And that then leads to, because you're hiring new staff, you're trying to keep up with all of this, you run into resource limits. And then what ends up happening is you hit a ceiling at some point where you go, we can't grow anymore because either we don't have enough money, we don't have a big enough building, we don't have enough staff. Somewhere we've hit a wall or a ceiling in our growth. And that is, I think, these are some of the limitations of the way we have done church, is that in this centralized fashion, is that we have these limits that we hit. There are those that break through them, but it certainly is a challenge. I may come back to this other point, debating whether I should share this now or share this later, but I may do this a little bit later. But I will say this, I think that one of the other problems, can you just flip back to the previous slide? I just want to make one other quick point that I think might be relevant here. Is you might be thinking, well, we can get by doing the small groups and make that work. Here's one of the challenges that I'm going to pose to you, and then when we talk about the decentralization, how this can make a big difference, is that you've probably heard this saying, how you win them is how you're going to keep them. Yeah. Have you heard that? Where basically how you get people into the church, how you attract them into the church is what you're going to need is to keep them in the church. So if what you're doing to attract people to the church is through your worship, through your Sunday morning experience, if you change that up on people, you're basically you're basically going against the contract that you set up with them. Because you're basically saying to them, we want you to come, we want you to come to the Sunday morning thing, and we're going to give you all that we have. But if we change that up at all, you're going to be they're going to be disappointed. Because here's how it plays out. If we tell people we want you to get into small groups, they're going to say, well, that's not what I came for. I signed up to come here because I like the Sunday morning experience. I like the worship, I like the preaching, you have children's program, maybe you get good coffee, I don't know. Typically churches have lousy coffee, but maybe you have good coffee. But if you win them, if you're trying to win people and get people to come because of the Sunday morning experience, anything else you offer will always be treated as optional.
Interesting.
So small groups will not be considered a high value item for people. Now some people will, they'll see the need for it, and you're going to be there, hammering away at it, you're going to be begging, pleading, cajoling, maybe bribing them to get into small groups. And to a certain extent it'll work. But it'll never fully work because that's what they signed up for. How you win them is how you're going to have to keep them. You're going to have to keep them by keeping that worship experience Sunday morning really good. Otherwise, they'll switch, they'll move. I share that with you because when we talk about this next way of looking at things, we're going to change it up a little bit here. And this is where it gets scary. This is why you're going to resist a little to some of the things I'm going to share with you. Okay? Because you know that if you change the focus from centralized church or worship Sunday morning central with breakoffs into small groups, if you change that, people might stop coming or might stop liking you or stop giving or something. And so we fear those things and therefore we resist. So let's jump ahead then to the next slide. Yeah, we'll go there. To talk about missional communities. I'm going to propose to you, some of you have heard this terminology, some of you haven't, but I want to make sure you understand it. And I want to propose to you, and this isn't just a theory, this is something I've been living out myself over the last 8-9 years, and something that I've experienced and seen others doing it well, sometimes not doing it well, but people trying and learning. But I believe missional communities, however you want to define them or describe them or implement them, but missional communities could be an answer to help us all as we pursue our ministries to go forward, not only to improve our efficiencies internally, but to be more effective in reaching people for the gospel in this time. So missional communities just as a definition. And by the way, sometimes they're called communities on mission, or some people call them micro churches, and I've heard things like gospel communities on mission, and all sorts of different names. And really, the name isn't as important, but I can get into a whole discussion on that as well. But here's the definition: groups of Christ followers, typically numbering between 20 and 50, so in that social space range, that define and organize themselves around God's mission to their local context. So that's a definition, and like all definitions, they sound very academic and very tight. But it's really, you're gathering people together in a 20 to 50 range, but the organizing principle is mission. Hear that, mission. Now, how is that different than a small group? A small group organizes typically for what? Discipleship, Bible study, discussion, prayer, possibly, those kind of things, right? So there is an internal focus. Again, nothing wrong with that. In the personal space setting, the small groups are good. Yeah, I'm not down on small groups. Do small groups, but just recognize that they're good for what they're good for, but they're not good for mission. Missional communities define themselves around mission, which solves a lot of issues. Remember we talked about the fact that we need to be reaching our world for Christ, and that our current ways of doing it are not working. Imagine mobilizing our people with a missional mindset to their world. So let's take a look here at go to the next slide here. Just some comments here about missional communities, how they work, what some of their advantages are, etc. Number one, it maximizes social space. You address the social space aspect of your church. Now, there are some of you that are church already of 20 to 50. What if you intentionally shifted to become more of a missional community and just recognize that's who you are? Instead of trying to be the public space church that you are not, what if you just began to say, hey, we're going to function like a missional community? And the big piece of it has to require purpose, and in this case, it's mission. Because if you don't, and I know some of you already think, well, if we create another group in the church, it'll just, it'll be nice for a while, and then people will just wither away and die, and they won't like it. And that's true. Because what ends up happening, we create these things as programs, and we say, well, let's get together, let's share a meal together, let's get 20 people in the room and do something. And that'll get old pretty quickly. The first few times you do it, everybody will be excited, and then within 3-4 months, it'll be like everything else. But the point is, if you're mobilizing them on mission, if you're saying to them, the reason you're coming together is because you are called, you're coming together to meet a particular mission, whatever that is. And so when I say a mission, I don't mean just a program. Something we're gonna go pick up garbage or off the street, which isn't a bad thing. But that's not a mission. But it really is, where's God's heart for you? And where's God, what has God laid on your heart that you need to be doing within your community? And it could be something, it could be, and there's no simple answer. But as you pray and seek the Lord and try to find where the needs are in your community, and you allow God to speak to you, and you invigorate these groups to find ways to strategize and to work to make a difference in their communities, suddenly they take on new purpose and new meaning, and they want to get together because they want to make a difference in their world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but it really has to be mission focused, otherwise it just becomes a social club, which we don't want. Missional communities are great for incorporating outsiders, because as I talked about this morning earlier, social space is a perfect environment for new people to break into, because the bonds are not so tight that you can't break through those friendship bonds. You can come in, you can keep, for a new person, it's safe, nobody's going to ask them a really difficult question. If they come to a small group, you're going to be asking them to share something, or maybe pray around the circle or something, and for new people, that could just be like really super scary. But a missional community is a safe place for new people to come in, and if you approach it right, they'll want to join you on some of the mission you're doing. They may not even know that they're doing it in the name of Jesus, but they're doing it. And they're beginning to watch you do it, and they're going, wow, these people love God, they love the world, and I want to be part of it. It's a seedbed for discipleship, because in missional communities, if you're doing missional communities right, you're not living together, but you're trying to, in a 21st century context, you are doing life on life together as much as possible. You're sharing meals together, you're spending time together, you're getting to know each other. They get to see Christ at work in people's lives because you're doing life on life together. And some of you have heard Michael talk about up, in, and out. And if you're not familiar with that, it just means different rhythms that we have in church life, of worship, of community, community/fellowship, and of course the out is the mission aspect of it, the call that God has for us within the world. A missional community can do all those things and incorporate them quite well. Okay, so let me show you a diagram here that is a little different. So you saw the other diagram where we had worship and then the small groups around it. What if you were to organize your church this way? Notice the red, which I'm saying the primary unit. What if we were to go back to the oikos concept of the first century and have these social space groups as being our primary units, as they were in the first century when the church was kicking off. that these missional communities become your primary units that come together regularly. And in a larger church, that could be weekly. In a smaller church, that might be less frequently. It might be monthly. Or if you're a really small church, maybe it's as you band together with other churches. You know, as I proposed this morning, maybe you get together with some other churches in your community once a month to make sure that you're addressing the public space aspect. But you have a worship, you have a hub that not only provides worship, but that resources and supports your missional communities. The goal of it is not to get people to the hub, it's to the hub to support the missional communities. And the missional communities then also have small groups within them, because you recognize that there's still a need for the more intense discipleship, Bible study, all those good things that we do at that level. Now, what this does, and let's go to the next screen, just talk about some of the just talk a little bit about this. So what we're doing in this decentralized approach is what we're doing is shifting the primary church expression to missional communities. We're moving it away from the center being the Sunday morning experience, and we're saying that we're making these social space settings the primary unit of the church. And then the hub then becomes the resource and connector for the missional communities. It exists to support the missional communities, not vice versa. Because right now, the way we do church, everything goes into feeding the Sunday morning experience. Yep. And now you might say, well, no, we're not like that. We have good small groups, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you why I don't believe you. And I don't know if anybody's saying that, but if you're thinking that right now, I'll tell you why I don't believe you. Because it boils down to this. If you canceled one of them, which one would people be more upset by? So if you cancel if you go back, or if you think of the centralized model, if you cancel small groups in your church, how many people would be upset? I mean, there might be some people that are upset, but would that be the deal breaker for them as to whether or not you were a church? But if you cancel Sunday morning, and said, we're now going to move people to, whether it's missional communities or small groups, well, how would people react? See, you know what? One of the reasons we had trouble in the pandemic, so let me go back to the pandemic thing for you for a moment here. And this is why churches, when the pandemic came, we all had to isolate, and we suddenly had to figure out how to use Facebook Live, streaming, and all this kind of stuff. Remember that? Yeah. Guys, I know you're all tech wizards now, and you can do this in your sleep. But back then, when you were still trying to figure that out, the reason is because we struggled, is because we had to make sure that Sunday morning experience was there, because that was the only glue we had in the church. Woo. What if we would have been already prepared at that point, and we had that the Sunday morning experience, and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have it. I'm just saying, is that the glue? Is that the thing that holds us together? What if our missional communities were already in place? People had relationships at a different level. Yeah, they may not be able to get together in purpose. I mean, they might not be able to get together in person, but they've got enough connection there that they could much more easily survive. But because of most of our churches, we were addicted, I'll put it this way, we're addicted to the need to be together on Sunday morning. And without that, we felt like we couldn't exist. I mean, I've talked to pastors. I mean, I work with pastors, a lot. I mean, we have 47 churches in our district. I mean, I've talked to pastors who just felt like their whole identity disappeared when they couldn't preach on a Sunday morning or have them be in front of an audience, because that was their identity, was that Sunday morning experience. Shifting the focus could make a significant difference, but it is risky and it's scary and it is difficult, but it really, I think, could make a difference, because what it could do then, it could mobilize us to do ministry in fresh new ways without some of the limits, because you don't need the level of staffing, the financial commitments and investments that are required in a church that is centralized. Let me show you an example. I mean, we don't have a lot of time to go through this, but I want to give you a case study. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Underground Network in Tampa, Florida. I had a chance to visit there before the pandemic, and I've kept in contact with them since. In fact, one of our churches in Washington State just sent a leadership team field trip there this week. I haven't even talked to them yet to find out how that went, but we've had a lot of interest in our district with the underground movement in Tampa. And the underground is a network of over 100, what they call microchurches, but they're missional communities. And this isn't something they just came up with. They've been doing this for close to 15 years. So this is not, it's easy to say, oh yeah, somebody tried this, it's going to die in a couple of years. They've been doing this for like a long time. And I had a chance to go there and visit and spend a few days there, visit some of these micro churches, talk to some of the leaders, see their hub, and it is incredible. Because each of these micro churches, and even to be recognized as a micro church and to be part of it, number one, you have to have certain, they have to have certain minimal, they have what they call ecclesial minimums, which is basically the up in and out. But in order to do that, every micro church has to have a mission. And every microchurch is defined by its mission. And they have missions there, things like reaching out to, because in Tampa is a big, one of the major, you may not be aware of this, but I didn't know this when I got to Tampa either. It's one of the big hubs for pornography in the United States, next to LA area. And they've got microchurches that are working with sex workers and people in the pornography industry. They've got microchurches that are working with immigrants and people that are coming out of prison. And each one of these microchurches has a particular calling that God has put in their lives, and they work in those areas. And they're diligent, and they're making an impact. If you spend time in Tampa, you'll hear about the underground, but they don't even call themselves a church, they call themselves the underground movement. It's these micro-churches that have the identity that are doing some amazing things in that city. And what's fascinating is they have about 100 plus micro-churches, several thousand people in total that will be part of this, this network of micro-churches. I think when we were there in Tampa, at that point, we only had 1 or 2 full-time staff people.
Wow.
And a few part-time. And very few staff, because they don't need staff. They don't need a lot of staff. The whole purpose of the hub of the organization, the infrastructure, is to support the microchurches, to help them be strong.
Wow.
And they have a weekly gathering. It was really funny. I got to tell you this quick story here. I know we're heading to lunch here pretty quickly, but when I flew over and I did one of those red-eye flights, you fly overnight, you get there the next morning, you're not sure where you are or why you're even awake, but I got there, drove into Tampa, and the first thing that was available was to go visit their Sunday experience that they have, that they promote. And what they have done, they've rented space in an old mall. Like there's malls. By the way, malls are great because there's all sorts of space there. And I think there's great potential for churches to utilize space in malls that are closing down all over the place. So they've rented some space in a mall near the university in Tampa. And they gave me the address and said, go there, this is where we meet for Sunday morning. Well, I'm going there, because I'm thinking like I typically do when I'm going to visit a new church, and especially like a big church that has a lot of influence. And I'm thinking, there'll be signs and all this kind of stuff. There were no signs. In fact, there was another family I found that was wandering around looking for something as well, and I asked them what they were doing, and they were looking for it as well. Because the underground does not publicly, they don't advertise their Sunday morning service. Now it's available. Everyone in their network is aware of it, but there's no signs, they don't send out brochures, they don't have big billboards or places in the parking lot saying, here's where you go. That's not important to them. The Sunday morning experience is mainly for the people in their network who want to have a corporate worship experience. And especially they value it for the leaders. They want the leaders to be there. But they're not It is not the driving force of their church experience. See, for us, it's backward. But we would do the opposite. We want the Sunday morning experience, and then we try to, move them out into small groups. Their whole thing is to get people in microchurches, and then make them aware that there's a public space that they can be part of. They had a great worship service, but it was only maybe a few hundred people. Because their microchurches are meeting the needs for the most part of their people, but for those who occasionally want and need and require more of a larger public space setting, they provide that. So if you're interested, there's some really fascinating stories what they're doing. They are certainly probably some of the trendsetters in this, and they are now setting up hubs around the world. I think they've got like 9 other city hubs that they're creating in other places in the world, including like Ireland and a few other places in the U.S. Fascinating. And what we're doing in our district, so in the Pacific Northwest Association of the Church of God, we have several churches that were started as missional communities. And we are right now, literally in this process, we're hoping to have this fully in place within the next couple of months, is to establish our own hub. It's not going to be affiliated with the underground, but we're creating our own hub as a way to draw in our missional communities that are going to be basically one church in many locations. And we already have people that are talking to us to say, how can we join your hub? How can we become part of your hub? We have inquiries that we could have, within the next, if this hub develops and grows, we could have maybe like 10 missional communities part of this hub within the next year.
Beautiful.
So it's really exciting. I mean, there's some really neat possibilities, but we're thinking more of a decentralized model that doesn't require the resources and doesn't have some of the limitations that I think a lot of it you would find in the centralized model. Okay. I've given you a lot of stuff, and I know you probably have more questions. You probably want to start throwing things at me or whatever. That's all possible. I know we have to go for lunch, so let's leave lunch. Let's go for lunch. You can ask me questions personally. We're going to have Q&A after our afternoon session. And I'm going to leave you in our afternoon session with practical stuff that everyone can take home. So this is going to be the one that's going to challenge you. What we just did is the stuff that's going to challenge you the most. But we'll come back after lunch and work on the rest.
Great. Thanks. Give it up for Lloyd, please. Pray. Before I pray and release us to go there, I want you to take hold of what you've just heard and not let your stomach lead to have you forget it. So let's take 1 minute, literally 60 seconds of just silence. You can close your eyes if you want, but it's not about prayer. I just want you to just really reflect. What's the thing that God is catching your attention with? It could be something that annoyed you. It could be something that excited you. Who knows? I just want you to take some time and just really reflect. What's the one thing from that you need to grab hold of? Go. All right, with that thought now, many of you came here with somebody else, and on the way over there, I want you to start sharing what that thing was that was grabbing your attention. Some of you are going to be sitting down at a table if you came here alone. I want you to find somebody that you can share that thing that was catching your attention. Join me in prayer, and I'll bless this. Thank you, Lord, for this space. We bless this house and the leaders here. And we thank you for the food that is in front of us in just a moment. We pray your blessings upon it. We receive it as a gift from your hand. Thank you for the things that you're doing across this region. Thank you for the milestones. Thank you for this challenging message to really consider. In Jesus' name, amen.